On a bright but chilly Saturday morning in Westerville, Helen Whitaker stood in her kitchen, carefully placing the last layer of powdered sugar over a tray of warm pastries. She had woken earlier than usual, humming to herself as she baked, imagining the look on her son's face when he opened the door. Andrew had always loved her pastries when he was a boy, and although adulthood had changed many things, Helen still held on to the hope that a small gesture might bring them closer again. She carried the tray to her car, covered it with foil, and drove toward the apartment complex where Andrew lived with his wife, Caroline. As she walked down the hallway, the familiar mix of nervousness and quiet optimism stirred inside her. Maybe this visit would feel different. Maybe this time she would be welcomed like family. When the door opened, however, the warmth she hoped for never arrived. Caroline stood in the doorway with a tightly controlled smile, the kind that looked polite from a distance but felt cold up close. "Oh, Helen." "Hi," she said, stepping back without actually inviting her in. Andrew appeared behind her, glancing at his mother with a surprised stiffness, as if her presence required explanation. "I brought pastries," Helen said lightly, lifting the tray with a little smile. "I thought you two might enjoy them." Caroline accepted the tray, holding it like something fragile she didn't particularly want to touch. "Thank you," she murmured, her tone pleasant enough, though her eyes darted to Andrew in a silent exchange Helen couldn't decipher. Helen tried to ignore the tension and walked further inside. The apartment looked freshly arranged, with new decor and framed photos on the shelves. Photos Helen had never seen before. She sat on the edge of the couch while Andrew and Caroline stayed standing, as if unsure how long she planned to stay. "How have things been?" Helen asked, trying to start a conversation. Andrew shrugged. "Busy. Work's been crazy," Caroline added, "and wedding planning, well, it's been a lot." Helen's face brightened. "Wedding planning, yes. I was actually thinking maybe next month we could—" She never finished the sentence. Caroline spoke too quickly, too casually, as if the truth slipped out before she could stop it. "Oh, we already took care of that. We registered yesterday." Silence dropped like a stone between them. Helen blinked. "Yesterday." Andrew shifted uncomfortably. Caroline gave a small, awkward laugh. "Yeah, just a small thing. Nothing big. We invited only our closest family." The words landed exactly where they weren't supposed to. Closest family. Helen felt something in her chest tighten. A quiet crack she didn't want them to hear. She tried to smile, but her lips trembled. "I see," she said softly. "Well, congratulations." Neither Andrew nor Caroline tried to fill the silence that followed. Neither explained. Neither apologized. Their indifference hurt more than any argument ever could. Helen stayed for a few minutes longer, pretending she didn't feel the invisible wall pressing her out the door. When she finally left, carrying the empty foil she had brought the pastries in, she walked slowly down the hall, keeping her gaze on the floor so strangers wouldn't see the tears gathering in her eyes. Back home, the quiet felt heavier than usual. Helen hung her coat, sat on the edge of her bed, and opened her phone out of habit, only to freeze. Photo after photo filled her screen. Caroline's social media page displayed a full wedding celebration. Flowers, champagne, posed family portraits, Caroline laughing in a white dress, Andrew with his arm around her. The two of them surrounded by guests. Everyone invited, except her. Helen scrolled until the images blurred. The realization washed over her with a cold, unforgiving clarity. She had been shut out completely, not forgotten. Shut out. The humiliation sank deep, settling into a place she had ignored for years. And in that quiet, devastating moment, something inside her finally began to wake up. A week passed, though the sting of the wedding photos never truly left Helen's chest. She filled her days with small routines, watering her plants, rearranging the pantry, trying to quiet the thoughts that replayed every detail of that painful visit. She did not hear from Andrew or Caroline once during those 7 days, not a text or a call. The silence seemed intentional, and oddly, that hurt almost as much as the wedding itself. But on Thursday afternoon, her phone finally rang. Caroline's name flashed across the screen. For a moment, Helen let it ring, uncertain if she had the strength to pretend everything was fine. But habit and hope made her answer. "Hello, Caroline," she said softly. Caroline didn't bother with greetings. She launched straight into a shaky, breathless panic. "Helen, thank God you picked up. We're in trouble. The rent is overdue again, and the landlord said we could be evicted any day now. Andrew's at work, and I'm terrified. I don't know what to do." Helen closed her eyes, the familiar script unfolding with painful accuracy. Rent, groceries, car repairs, medical bills that never quite made sense, furniture she never saw again. For 3 years, she had quietly covered every emergency that fell into their laps. Tens of thousands of dollars sent out of love, out of duty, out of the belief that family should support each other. But something inside her had changed. Helen leaned back in her chair. "Why is the rent overdue? I thought Andrew got a raise last month." Caroline let out a dramatic sniffle. "It wasn't as much as he expected, and things have been tight since the wedding. We used our savings for the ceremony, and now, well, we just need a little help. Just this month. Please." There it was. The justification, the plea, the familiar tug on guilt she had felt too many times before. Helen didn't respond immediately. She thought of the wedding photos, the smiling guests, the celebration she was never meant to be part of. She thought of how she found out by accident, not by love. She thought of how they only reached for her when they wanted something. Caroline, sensing hesitation, shifted her tone. "Mom, please." Helen flinched at the word. It wasn't affection. It was strategy. For years, she had accepted it, grateful for any scrap of closeness. But now, hearing it used as a tool dug into her like a blade. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "Caroline, I can't help this time." Silence. Then a brittle laugh. "Didn't you hear me? We could be evicted." "I did hear you," Helen said gently, "but I can't continue paying your bills. I have helped for a long time. Far longer than I should have." Caroline's sweetness evaporated. "So you're just abandoning us?" "No," Helen answered softly, surprising herself with how calm she felt. "But I'm choosing not to abandon myself anymore." Before Caroline could launch into another argument, Helen added, "I hope you and Andrew figure things out. Truly. But I won't be sending money." She ended the call. For several minutes, Helen sat motionless, listening to the quiet hum of her refrigerator, the ticking of the kitchen clock. Then she reached for a notebook in her drawer and began writing. Every payment, every transfer, every grocery trip, every little emergency. By the time she finished, the total stunned her. Over 3 years, she had supported them with enough money to change her own life. Tens of thousands of dollars gone. But for the first time, instead of regret, she felt clarity. Saying no wasn't cruelty. It was the beginning of choosing herself. Helen woke early the next morning, long before the sun had fully risen over Westerville. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that usually magnified her loneliness. But today it felt different, lighter somehow. She brewed a small pot of coffee, sat at her kitchen table, and stared at the notebook she had filled the night before. The numbers were still there. Stark and undeniable, each line a reminder of how easily she had given and how rarely she had been seen. She took a slow breath, closed the notebook, and slipped it into her purse. Today would be different. By 8 o'clock, she was walking into the Huntington Bank branch she had used for decades. The familiar scent of coffee and printer ink greeted her, along with a young teller who offered a professional smile. Helen requested to speak with an account specialist. And a few minutes later, she was seated with a representative in a quiet cubicle. "What can I help you with today, Mrs. Whitaker?" the woman asked gently. Helen folded her hands in her lap. "I need to stop all automatic transfers, and I need to change all account access. My son no longer needs to be linked to my finances." The representative nodded, neither surprised nor judgmental. "Of course, we can take care of that." As the woman pulled up the account settings, Helen watched the screen. Rows of scheduled transfers she had once approved without a second thought. There was no anger in her as she reviewed them, only a deep, steady resolve. One by one, each transfer was canceled. One by one, every form of shared access was removed. By the time the representative printed the confirmation documents, Helen felt as though she had set down a weight she had been carrying for years. "Everything is protected now," the woman said kindly. "Only you have access." Helen nodded, her eyes warming with gratitude. "Thank you." When she stepped outside, the morning air hit her with a crisp coolness that made her pause. Instead of going straight home, she turned toward a neighborhood trail she used to walk years ago, back when life felt simpler. She hadn't visited it in so long that she almost forgot how peaceful it was. The rustle of leaves, the distant sound of children waiting at a school bus stop, the soft hum of traffic far enough away to feel like background noise. She walked slowly at first, then more confidently as her mind settled into the rhythm of movement. She didn't think about Andrew. She didn't think about Caroline. She didn't think about bills or excuses or the endless cycle of giving and hoping. Instead, she thought about breathing, about the feel of the path under her feet, about herself, just herself, for the first time in years. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. There was no fireworks or sudden revelation, just a quiet shift inside her, steady and unmistakable. This was what it felt like to stop living from guilt. This was what it felt like to reclaim even the smallest piece of freedom. And for Helen Whitaker, that was more than enough to keep walking. Helen felt calmer than she had in weeks as she pulled into her driveway that afternoon. The cool Ohio air drifted through the cracked window of her car. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of control over her own life. She had protected her bank accounts. She had set boundaries. The simple act of choosing herself had settled into her bones like quiet strength. But as she turned onto her street, the calm evaporated. 3 unfamiliar cars were parked in front of her house. Andrew's sedan, Caroline's SUV, and a sleek black vehicle she didn't recognize. All 3 were clustered directly by her walkway, as if staking a claim on the property. Helen's heartbeat stuttered. She parked slowly, gripping the steering wheel, then stepped out with measured caution. Andrew emerged first, striding toward her with an expression that hovered somewhere between irritation and forced sympathy. Caroline followed, clutching her coat dramatically around her as if she had been waiting in the cold for hours. A third man, a well-dressed stranger carrying a leather briefcase, stood on the porch, observing her approach with professional detachment. "Mom," Andrew said, tone clipped. "We need to talk." Helen paused at the foot of her steps. "About what?" Caroline exhaled impatiently. "Please don't make this harder than it has to be." The stranger stepped forward and extended a hand. "Mrs. Whitaker, I'm Stephen Grant. Andrew and Caroline asked me to stop by. They're worried about you." Helen didn't take his hand. Why would they be worried? Stephen offered a sympathetic smile. The rehearsed kind lawyers practiced in the mirror. "They're concerned about your mental stability. You've been acting unpredictably." Helen blinked. "Unpredictably?" Andrew nodded, arms crossed. "Yes, canceling payments without warning. Refusing to help us when you always have before. It's erratic, Mom." Caroline tilted her head, faux sorrow in her eyes. "We know something is wrong. We're just trying to make sure you're okay." Helen felt a slow burn at the back of her throat, a mixture of disbelief and the sharp beginning of anger. Nothing is wrong with me. I simply made a decision. Stephen pulled a folder from his briefcase and opened it carefully. We're here to help ensure your financial responsibilities are managed properly. Andrew is willing to take that on so you can focus on your health and well-being. Helen stared at the papers, thick documents filled with legal jargon she didn't need to read to understand. Caroline pointed to the signature lines. Just sign these, and Andrew can take care of everything. The bills, the accounts, all the things you've been struggling with. I haven't been struggling, Helen said firmly. Andrew's voice sharpened. Mom, stop pretending. You're overwhelmed. You're making irrational decisions. Irrational? Helen repeated, holding his gaze. Or simply different from what you want. Stephen stepped in again before Andrew could reply. Mrs. Whitaker, if you refuse to cooperate, there could be legal consequences. It's important that someone responsible handles your finances. Helen's chest tightened. This wasn't concern. This wasn't love. This was strategy, calculated, rehearsed, and designed to scare her into compliance. Her voice grew steadier with each word. I will not be signing anything. Caroline's expression snapped, her polite facade crumbling. You're being impossible. You weren't like this before. Something is clearly wrong with you. Andrew threw his hands up. This is exactly what we're talking about. You're acting unstable. Unstable. Helen felt her composure harden like glass. I am perfectly capable of managing my own life, and I want all three of you off my property. Stephen's mask slipped for the first time. Mrs. Whitaker. Refusing may escalate matters. Helen opened her front door wide and stepped aside. Leave. Now. Andrew lingered, jaw clenched, as if debating whether to push further. Caroline muttered something under her breath and stormed toward the car. Stephen gathered his papers with a cold, annoyed efficiency. We'll be in touch, he said. Helen didn't answer. She stood in the doorway until all three cars pulled away, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. This was the first major confrontation, and it confirmed exactly what she feared. They didn't want to help her. They wanted to control her. Helen locked the door after the last car pulled away, but the silence inside her house felt heavier than usual. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed her purse on the counter. For a moment, she stood motionless, trying to steady her breath. She had never imagined her own son would show up with a lawyer to question her sanity. The violation lingered like a shadow across her living room. A soft knock startled her. Helen hesitated before opening the door, but when she did, she found her neighbor Martha Doyle standing on the porch, bundled in a knitted cardigan, concern etched across her face. I didn't mean to intrude, Martha said gently, but I heard some of the commotion. Are you all right? Helen pressed her lips together, fighting the instinct to say she was fine. Instead, she opened the door wider. Come in. Martha stepped inside and immediately reached for Helen's hand. I saw those three storm off. The whole street could hear that young woman yelling. What happened? The kindness in her voice undid Helen's last bit of composure. She sank into the armchair as Martha sat across from her. Slowly, she explained what had happened, how Andrew and Caroline had shown up with an attorney, how they accused her of being unstable, and how they tried to pressure her into signing papers she barely understood. Martha listened quietly, her expression tightening with each word. When Helen finished, Martha exhaled a long, weary sigh. You're not imagining this, she said, and you're not alone. She paused, her eyes growing distant. My daughter tried something similar 5 years ago. She pushed for control of my bank accounts, said it was for my safety. Took me months to realize it was just manipulation. Helen looked up sharply. Your daughter? Martha nodded. People don't always become kinder with age. Sometimes they become more desperate, and they look at parents like resources. Her voice softened. I'm so sorry Andrew is doing this to you. You don't deserve that. Helen swallowed hard, emotion rising in her throat. I thought I raised him better. You did, Martha said firmly, but his choices are his own. For the first time since the confrontation, Helen felt a small anchor drop inside her. She wasn't crazy, she wasn't imagining threats, and she wasn't the only one who had lived through this kind of betrayal. That truth steadied her. After Martha left, Helen sat quietly for a few minutes, gathering herself before picking up the phone and dialing her sister. Diane, she said when the call connected. Diane's voice was brisk, familiar, grounding. Helen, you sound upset. What happened? Helen told her everything. Andrew's accusations, Caroline's theatrics, Stephen Grant's implied threats. She spoke slowly, her voice cracking only once. Diane didn't hesitate. I'm going to be blunt, she said. Andrew and Caroline have always seen you as their financial plan. Not family. A plan. Helen closed her eyes. Hearing it spoken aloud hurt more than she expected. But it also felt like a truth she had been circling for years without naming. Diane continued. This isn't about concern. It's about control. About money. And now that you've finally said no, they're panicking. Helen pressed a hand to her chest. I just didn't think they would go this far. People who depend on your kindness rarely appreciate it, Diane replied. They only notice when it stops. Helen didn't speak for a moment, but something inside her settled, an emotional grounding she desperately needed. She wasn't losing her mind. She wasn't overreacting. What happened at her door wasn't love twisted. It was exploitation revealed. And for the first time, she sensed the community around her shifting, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly aligning at her side. She wasn't alone anymore. The morning after her conversations with Martha and Diane, Helen woke with a clear plan forming in her mind. She lay in bed for a few extra seconds, listening to the faint hum of the furnace, feeling a steadiness she hadn't felt in months. The fear from the previous day had settled into something firmer, resolve. By mid-morning, she stood at her front door with a local locksmith, a polite man with a van parked in her driveway. He removed the old brass lock she'd had for over a decade and replaced it with a new, reinforced deadbolt. He added a second lock on the side door and checked every window latch as she followed him from room to room. When he finished, he handed Helen the new set of keys. She turned them over in her hand, the metal cool against her skin. Thank you, she said, and meant it in a way she couldn't fully express. After he left, she opened her laptop and ordered a Ring doorbell camera, along with 2 additional outdoor cameras. She had them installed the same afternoon by a technician who walked her through the phone app and showed her how to check motion alerts and save recordings. He didn't ask why she needed the system, but Helen sensed he already knew. People in the service industry tended to recognize trouble without being told. Next, she sat at her kitchen table, pulled out her phone and blocked Andrew's number. Then Caroline's. Then the shared number they used for apartment emergencies. For a moment, her finger hovered hesitantly over the final confirmation button, but she pressed it. A quiet, decisive click. The silence that followed didn't feel like absence. It felt like protection. With the locks changed and her phone no longer a gateway to anxiety, Helen began reclaiming small parts of her life. She cleaned out the hallway closet, donating coats she no longer wore. She rearranged the living room furniture, shifting the couch so it faced the window instead of the door, a subtle act, but one that made her home feel like hers again. She even opened the curtains fully, letting in the pale, winter sunlight. For years, she had kept them slightly drawn, partly out of habit, partly for privacy, partly because she rarely felt she deserved a bright, open space. But now the light spilled across her floors, warming the hardwood and softening the edges of the room. That evening, Instead of worrying about whether Andrew would call or what Caroline might need, she brewed a pot of chamomile tea, turned on a soft lamp, and read a book she'd abandoned months ago. She didn't check her phone once. She didn't flinch at footsteps outside. She didn't listen for the sound of a car pulling up. For the first time in years, peace didn't feel like something she was borrowing. It felt like something she had finally earned. And though the world outside remained unchanged, Helen Whitaker's home, and the life she was slowly reclaiming, felt entirely different. Saturday afternoon settled quietly over Westerville, the kind of stillness that made the wind chimes on Helen's porch sound louder than usual. She had just finished watering her plants when she heard engines outside, multiple engines, the kind that didn't simply drive by, but stopped with purpose. Her pulse flickered. Through the living room window, she saw Andrew's sedan, Caroline's SUV, and a second dark vehicle she didn't recognize. For figures stepped out, Andrew, Caroline, and two men she'd never seen before. They walked toward her house with a sharp, determined stride. Before Helen could reach the door, the pounding began. "Mom, open the door!" Andrew shouted, slamming his fist against the wood hard enough to rattle the frame. "We know you're home." Caroline's voice shrieked over his. "Open this door right now. You can't hide from us." The two unfamiliar men stood behind them, broad-shouldered, arms crossed, an intimidation tactic Helen recognized instantly. Her hand trembled, but she steadied herself and stepped back, choosing not to go near the door. The pounding intensified. "Helen!" Caroline screamed. "You better open up. This is ridiculous." Helen swallowed and reached for her phone. "I'm calling the police." There was a brief pause, then Caroline scoffed loudly, shouting through the door, "Go ahead! You think they'll take your side? You're unstable." But Helen had already dialed. "Columbus Police Department, what's your emergency?" the dispatcher asked. Helen kept her voice calm. "This is Helen Whitaker. My son, daughter-in-law, and two unknown men are on my porch, banging on my door demanding entry. They won't leave. We're sending officers now, ma'am. Stay inside and away from the door." She hung up and stood in the center of her living room, breathing slowly, grounding herself in the quiet authority of her own home. The shouting outside continued, accusations, insults, demands, but for the first time, she didn't feel powerless. She felt protected. Within minutes, two patrol cars pulled up. Flashing lights cut across the driveway as two officers approached the porch. "What's going on here?" one of them asked. Andrew spun around. "Finally, my mother is refusing to let us in. She's not well, and we need to take care of her." Helen opened the front door just enough to step onto the threshold. "Officers, I did not invite them here," she said clearly. "They've been harassing me and trying to force their way into my home." Caroline threw her arms up theatrically. "Oh, please. She's confused. She needs help. We're just trying to keep her safe." One officer held up a hand. "Ma'am, step back, please." Then he turned to Helen. "Mrs. Whitaker, do you feel threatened?" "Yes," Helen said without hesitation. "And I want them off my property." The officer nodded and faced Andrew and Caroline. "This is a civil matter. You cannot force entry. You need to leave." Andrew's face darkened. "You don't understand. She owes us. She's been supporting us for years. And now she's acting crazy." Caroline exploded with indignation. "We are her family. She has a responsibility to help us. She can't just cut us off." Helen stepped forward, just enough so they could see her clearly. Her voice was steady, grounded, unshakable. "I don't owe you anything," she said. "Not my money, not my time, not my peace." Andrew's jaw clenched. "You'll regret this. When you're old and alone, don't expect us to be there. Don't expect anyone to help you." For the first time in her life, Helen felt the weight of those words without fear. She lifted her chin. "I've already been alone," she said calmly. "What I won't be any more is controlled." Caroline scoffed loudly, pointing aggressively at Helen. "You're making a mistake. A huge mistake." But the officers stepped between them. "That's enough," one said firmly. "You need to leave the property now. If you come back and attempt to force entry again, it becomes trespassing." Andrew glared at his mother, fury twisting his features. Caroline cursed under her breath. The two men stepped back toward the cars, clearly frustrated they weren't needed. Helen didn't move until all four of them got into their vehicles and drove away. Only then did she let out a long breath, steady, slow, controlled. The police cars pulled away. Silence returned. This wasn't just another confrontation. It was the moment Helen realized she could stand alone and stand firmly. She had survived the storm without bending. And something inside her, something long dormant, finally felt unbroken. 3 days after the police confrontation, Helen was making tea when the doorbell rang. The chime cut through the quiet house, and for a moment, she froze, half expecting Andrew or Caroline to be on the other side again. But when she checked the Ring camera, the woman standing on her porch was alone, holding a county-issued tablet and wearing a polite, professional expression. Helen opened the door just a few inches. "Mrs. Whitaker?" the woman asked. "My name is Marissa Collins. I'm with Franklin County Adult Protective Services. I'm here regarding a welfare report filed about you." A cold heaviness settled in Helen's stomach. "A welfare report?" "Yes, ma'am," Marissa said gently. "The report alleges mental incompetence, unsafe living conditions, and an inability to manage daily needs." Helen exhaled slowly. Andrew and Caroline had escalated again. "I won't be discussing anything without my attorney present," Helen said firmly. Marissa nodded, neither surprised nor offended. "Of course. That's your right. I can wait outside or in my vehicle." "Please wait there," Helen replied. She closed the door, locked it, and immediately called Patrick O'Neill, the Columbus attorney her sister had recommended. He had handled elder exploitation cases for decades and had agreed to advise her if things escalated. "Patrick, APS is here," she said without greeting. "Andrew and Caroline must have filed a report." "I'll be there in 20 minutes," he said. "Do not let them inside or speak to them alone." Helen sat on the couch, hands folded tightly together, listening to the ticking clock as she waited. This wasn't fear anymore, it was exhaustion, a bone-deep weariness from being treated like a prize to be seized rather than a person to be respected. Exactly 19 minutes later, Patrick's SUV pulled into her driveway. He walked to the porch with a steady, reassuring stride, silver hair, calm eyes, briefcase in hand. He nodded at Helen on the other side of the doorbell camera, and she opened the door fully at last. Inside, Helen led him to the dining table, where he set down a thick folder. "Let's bring her in," he said. Helen opened the door again, inviting Marissa inside. The social worker stepped in politely, her gaze sweeping the house, clean, organized, quiet. Nothing remotely resembling the unsafe living conditions she had been told to expect. Patrick gestured toward the table. "Before we begin, I'd like to provide documentation." Marissa sat. Helen sat beside Patrick, a quiet but steady presence. Patrick opened the folder. "First, Mrs. Whitaker is fully competent. She manages her home, her bills, and her daily needs independently. Second, this is the important part, she has been the victim of financial exploitation by her son and daughter-in-law." He slid forward, printed bank records, digital transfers, summaries of cash withdrawals tied to Andrew and Caroline, and a timeline of the past 3 years. "These payments," Patrick said, "total over $40,000, all made under emotional pressure, manipulation, and false emergencies. When Mrs. Whitaker recently asserted boundaries, They retaliated by filing a fraudulent APS report. Marissa reviewed the documents silently, her expression tightening with each page. She turned to Helen. "Mrs. Whitaker, have you ever felt unsafe in your home?" "Not until they started trying to take it from me," Helen replied softly. "Have you ever been diagnosed with any condition affecting cognition or memory?" "No." "And are you able to manage your daily activities?" "Yes," Helen said firmly. "Completely." Marissa closed the file. "Well," she said, rising from her seat, "I'm closing this case. There is no evidence of mental incompetence, and your home is safe." She turned to Patrick. "And your documentation is thorough. Thank you." She glanced at Helen with a sympathetic expression. "I'm sorry you had to go through this." After Marissa left, Helen sank into her chair with a long, slow breath. Not relief exactly, something steadier. The ambush hadn't just failed, it had backfired, and for the first time the system saw the truth for exactly what it was. The peace that followed the APS visit lasted only 4 days. On the 5th morning, Helen opened her mailbox to find a thick packet from the Franklin County Probate Court. Her hands trembled as she tore the envelope open at her kitchen table. The first page was enough to steal the breath from her chest. Petition for guardianship of an alleged incompetent adult. Helen Marie Whitaker. Filed by Andrew Whitaker and Caroline Whitaker. Helen pressed a hand to her mouth. Even after everything, the lawyer, the lies, the APS ambush, she still hadn't expected this level of betrayal. Guardianship wasn't a small dispute. It was a legal declaration that she was incapable of managing her own life. If approved, Andrew would gain control of her finances, medical rights, home, everything. She immediately called Patrick O'Neill. He arrived within the hour. Patrick read the petition, carefully, jaw tightening. "This is serious," he said, "and sloppy." He tapped the documents with the back of his pen. They fabricated half of this. The petition was filled with evidence designed to paint Helen as unstable. Statements from 2 neighbors, claiming Helen wandered outside confused late at night. Helen recognized the names, people Andrew occasionally spoke to at block parties, neither of whom had ever been inside her home. Pharmacy notes, written in rushed handwriting, suggesting she had trouble remembering her prescriptions correctly. And most alarming, a psychiatric evaluation from someone named Dr. William Harris, stating she displayed concerning signs of cognitive decline. Helen stared at the pages. "I've never met this doctor." Patrick nodded grimly. "Because this wasn't a medical evaluation. This was an interview done under false pretenses, probably arranged by Andrew. It won't hold up, but they're hoping to intimidate you." Helen felt a cold, sinking ache in her chest, but she wasn't helpless. Not anymore. "What do we do?" she asked. "We gather real evidence," Patrick replied. "The truth is on your side, and we're going to prove it." Their preparation began that same afternoon. Patrick contacted the CVS pharmacy on Schrock Road, where Helen had filled prescriptions for years. The pharmacist, Mark Davis, who had known Helen since his first year on the job, agreed to meet them. Mark welcomed them into the consultation room with a reassuring smile. "Helen, I'm so sorry they dragged you into this mess. Those notes they submitted, they weren't written by me." He pulled up her medication history. "You've always been organized. You've never missed a refill window, never showed confusion. If anything, you correct me when I misread a dosage." He printed an official statement confirming her stable management of medications, signed, dated, and notarized by the store's supervisor. Next, Patrick compiled testimony from Helen's actual neighbors, the ones who knew her, not the ones Andrew had manipulated. Martha Doyle wrote a detailed letter describing Helen's independence and the financial exploitation she had witnessed. 2 other neighbors added statements about seeing Helen gardening, driving, doing errands, never once appearing disoriented. Still, The most important step was the one Patrick insisted on. A full neuropsychological evaluation, he said, by someone reputable, someone the court listens to. Helen agreed. Dr. Melissa Turner, a respected neuropsychologist at Ohio Health, met Helen 2 days later. The testing took hours, memory exercises, cognitive reasoning tasks, attention assessments, problem-solving evaluations. Helen felt mentally exhausted by the end, but she also felt something unexpected. Pride. She had nothing to hide. A week later, the results arrived. Dr. Turner called Helen personally. Your cognitive functioning is excellent, she said warmly. No impairment. No decline. You are fully capable of independent living. I'll prepare the full report for your attorney. When Patrick reviewed the results, he exhaled slowly. This is airtight. They can't argue against this. But even with their evidence, the tension grew as the court date approached. Helen could feel it in the quiet moments, the way the house seemed heavier at night, the way she double-checked her locks, the way she avoided looking toward the street in case Andrew appeared again. Patrick sensed her worry. Guardianship cases can be intimidating, he said gently. But remember this, they're the ones lying. We're the ones proving it. Helen nodded, gripping the folder of documents they had compiled together. Pharmacy testimony, statements from true neighbors, medical records, and now the neuropsychological report confirming her mental strength. The truth was finally laid out, clear, solid, undeniable. The next step was court, and whether she was ready or not, the final showdown was coming. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and cold, a thin layer of frost coating the courthouse steps. Helen stood beside Patrick as they walked into the Franklin County Probate Court, her hands clasped tightly around her folder of documents. She had barely slept the night before, but her expression was composed, quiet, steady, no longer shaken by intimidation. Inside the courtroom, Andrew and Caroline were already seated at the petitioner's table. Caroline wore a somber black dress, her expression arranged into the perfect mask of concern. Andrew sat upright, jaw clenched in self-righteous indignation. Beside them was Stephen Grant, his briefcase open, his posture confident, as though the outcome were already decided. Judge Eleanor Matthews entered, her presence sharp, perceptive, the kind that suggested she had seen every variety of family betrayal over her decades on the bench. The case was called. Stephen rose first. Your Honor, he began, voice heavy with false gravity, we are here because Mrs. Whitaker is unable to manage her finances or daily responsibilities. She is confused, vulnerable, and showing signs of cognitive decline. My clients, her loving son and daughter-in-law, are concerned for her safety. Caroline dabbed the corner of her eye with a tissue, as if on cue. Stephen continued, we will show clear evidence of her instability. He called his first witness, one of the neighbors who had signed a statement. The man took the stand nervously. Isn't it true, Stephen asked, that you've seen Mrs. Whitaker wandering outside late at night, looking disoriented? The man hesitated. Well, Andrew mentioned she'd been having problems. I don't know if I'd say disoriented. She just looked like she was, checking the mail or something, late at night. Stephen pressed. It was around 9, the man admitted. She seemed fine. Patrick rose smoothly. No further questions, Stephen muttered. Patrick stepped forward. Sir, have you ever spoken to Mrs. Whitaker about confusion, memory issues, or instability? No. Has she ever asked for help because she could not manage her home? No, Patrick nodded. Thank you. The testimony crumbled, just like that. Stephen's next witness was another neighbor, equally uncomfortable, equally vague, her statements dissolving under even mild questioning. Then came the supposed pharmacy evidence. Stephen waved a sheet of scribbled notes. Your Honor, these records show Mrs. Whitaker has repeatedly mixed up dosages. Patrick stood. Objection. The pharmacist who allegedly wrote those notes is present. Mark Davis approached the stand, crisp in his CVS badge and tie. Mr. Davis, Patrick asked, did you write these notes? No, Mark said plainly, and they contradict our records. Mrs. Whitaker has always managed her prescriptions responsibly. These notes were not created by me or anyone at our store. A murmur rippled across the courtroom. Stephen shifted uncomfortably. His final attempt, Dr. William Harris's so-called evaluation, collapsed even faster. Dr. Harris is not a licensed neuropsychologist, Patrick said. He conducted a brief conversation without Helen's consent and misrepresented it as an evaluation. We have a legitimate assessment from Ohio Health. Patrick submitted the full neuropsychological report from Dr. Melissa Turner. The judge reviewed it carefully. Excellent cognitive functioning, she read aloud. No impairment. No concerns. Stephen's case was unraveling thread by thread. Finally, Patrick glanced at Helen. Would you like to speak? She rose slowly, her palms slightly damp, but her voice steady. Your Honor, she began, I know I'm not perfect. I know I've made mistakes, mostly by giving too much and asking too little. For years, I helped my son because I believed that's what a mother should do. But when I finally set boundaries, I wasn't met with understanding or love. I was met with threats, lies, and attempts to take away the life I built for myself. She took a breath. I am not confused. I am not unsafe. I am not incompetent. I am simply a woman who has finally learned to protect herself. The courtroom was silent. Judge Matthews folded her hands. I've heard enough. She looked directly at Andrew and Caroline. The petition for guardianship is denied. There is no evidence, none, that Mrs. Whitaker is incompetent. What I do see, she continued, her tone firm, is an alarming pattern of financial dependence, manipulation, and retaliatory behavior on the part of the petitioners. This court will not be used as a tool for exploitation. Caroline's face flushed bright red. Andrew's lips tightened into a thin line of disbelief. Judge Matthews closed the file. Case dismissed. Outside the courthouse, the winter sun had begun to melt the frost. Martha Doyle was waiting on the steps, wrapped in her scarf. Diane arrived moments later, brisk and warm and full of fierce sisterly pride. They didn't celebrate loudly. They didn't shout or cry or make speeches. Instead, they walked with Helen to her car, held her shoulders, and reminded her, without needing words, that she wasn't alone. That evening, Helen sat by her living room window, watching the soft glow of the streetlights. For the first time in her life, she understood a truth she had spent years avoiding. Protecting herself wasn't selfishness. It was survival, and now it was freedom.